Today I want to tell you a heartfelt story from the Arizona Territory in 1881. It's about Nanvale, a Chiricahua Apache widower, a woman named Caroline and two children who built a home out of trust and second chance. In a land where kindness was scarce, they found each other. If this story touches your heart, leave me a comment. Now, let's begin. The sun was already burning hot over the San Pedro Valley when Nantonvale rain reined his mare to a halt. The wind carried the scent of dust and sun-worn sage, that sharp clean smell that belonged to this country alone. It had been out since first light, riding the fence line where cottonwood drum met the rocky rise of the Hotuka foothills. The wires sagged in places coyotes liked to slip through at night, and the monsoon storms earlier that summer had pulled posts loose from the softened earth. Nanton swung down, the creak of leather and the muted jingle of his cinch strap, the only sounds besides the wind. He wore no shirt in the heat. The brown gold of his skin darkened by years under the desert sun. His long black hair braided down his back with a hawk feather tucked near the tie. The scar along his left rib, white against his skin mouth, caught the light. They earned it in a winter skirmish years ago, back when he still scouted for the army, a chapter of life he rarely spoke about. The mare shifted, ears pricking. Nanton followed her gaze toward the wagon track, cutting across the open grassland. A shimmer of heat rose from it. But behind that shimmer moved two shapes low, deliberate. A woman and a boy, both walking with the lean of the road worn. Dust clung to the hem of the woman's calico skirt, her bonnet tilted to shade her face. The boy trailed close, his small hand gripping the handle of a battered canvas satchel. It wasn't common to see travelers on foot this far from Charleston, and those who came without a horse usually carried trouble in their shadow. Nanton set the post he'd been carrying, cinched the wire tight, and mounted again. He guided the mare toward the figures, keeping his approach steady, easy. Out here, sudden movement could turn strangers into enemies in the space of a heartbeat. When he drew close enough, the woman looked up. Her eyes were pale gray, the kind that saw farther than they should. Sweat streaked the dust on her cheeks. She stopped walking, planting herself in the road like a fence post that had been there all along. "Afternoon," she said, her voice rough from the dry air. Nanton nodded. "You're far from town." Her gaze flicked to the horizon behind him, then back. "We've been walking since yesterday. Our wagon axis sole split a day north of here. The man we hired to drive left before sunup took the horse with him." That's so Nanton's tone gave nothing away. The boy shifted, eyes darting from Nanton to the horse. His boots were worn at the toes, the sole on one side starting to peel. "He looked like he'd outgrown them months ago. We just need water," the woman said. Then after a pause and a place dry enough to sleep tonight, "we can pay and work." Nun studied her for a long moment. She didn't fidget under his stare, which told him she'd either been raised with grit or had it beaten into her by my life. "Name?" he asked. "Caroline Mercer," she replied. "This here's my boy Jamie." The boy gave a small nod but didn't speak. Kotumwo trole less than a mile ahead. Its thin line of trees a rare green against the baked land. "My place is yonder," Nanton said, inclining his head toward the cottonwoods. "Do you have water?" "Barn's got space." She nodded once in that way of people who've learned not to expect kindness. "We won't be trouble." He turned his mare, letting them follow on foot. The ranch came into view as the road dipped toward the creek. A single-story adobe and timber house sat near the bend, its porch shaded by the cottonwoods. A small corral, half in sun, held two galleyings flicking flies with their tails. Beyond the barn leaned just slightly from years of wind, but its roof was tight, and its doors hung straight. On the porch sat a girl, maybe 11, plaiting leather into a short rope. She was slight, her dark hair braided like her father's, though without the feather. At the sight of strangers, her hands stilled. She didn't stand, but her dark eyes followed every step. "This is my daughter Annie," Nanton said over his shoulder. He swung down from the saddle, led the mare to the trough, and loosened her cinch. Caroline and Jamie stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Anya looked at Caroline first, then at Jamie, and in her gaze was the quick appraisal children give other children, measuring, weighing, deciding. "The barn's round back," Dunn said, jerking his chin toward it. "Water's in the trough. Do you find a pump inside for more?" We age sleep there, Caroline said. She placed a hand on Jamie's shoulder. Thank you. Nan gave a short nod and led his horse toward the shade of the barn. He didn't watch them go, but he heard the barn door creak open, the soft scrape of boots on swept earth. That evening, the heat bled out of the skies, leaving the air cool enough to draw a blanket close. Non sat at his workbench just inside the barn, oiling a saddle. From the open doors, he could see Caroline settling Jamie on a pile of hay. The boy's eyes drooped as she pulled a patched blanket over him. She glanced toward Nanton, her face unreadable in the dim light. A memory stirred his wife Sunny, tucking Annie in on nights when the wind howled down from the hills. She'd been gone 3 years, taken by pneumonia that came fast and left only slants behind. Without a word, Danton reached for an extra wool blanket from a hook near the door. He also took a small cloth bag, holding roasted corn and a tin can. He walked to the barn door and set them just inside where Caroline would see them, but he wouldn't have to hand them over directly. Thank you, she said softly, but he was already walking back toward the house. Inside, Annie sat at the table, turning a small carved horse over in her hands. They staying? She asked. For the night, Nanan replied. Annie set the carving down. She looked tired. She is. Annie didn't speak for a while. Then Jamie's about my size. Nontan glanced at her. And his boots are worse than the ones you made me throw out last spring. Don's mouth twitched. Not quite a smell, but close. Eat your supper. Later, when the moon climbed above the cottonwoods, the barn lay quiet, except for the soft rustle of hay. Caroline sat awake, her back against the wall. The desert night was full of small sounds, the distant bark of a coyote, the whir of night insects. She thought of the road behind them, the splintered axle, the empty space where the wagon driver had been. She thought of how many doors had closed to her in the last year. This man, this Nandan, hadn't asked for her story. They offered water, sweets, and nothing more. She wasn't sure if that made him cautious or kind. Pulling the blanket tighter, she leaned her head back and closed her eyes, knowing dawn would come early in this land. By first light, the eastern sky was the color of pale copper. Danton was already at the corral, checking the hooves of the younger gelding. He heard movement by the barn and glanced over to see Caroline sweeping the loft above the stalls with a wide straw broom, her skirt tucked up for ease. Jaime stood by Annie, scattering grain for the chickens. Annie spoke to him in short bursts, pointing out which ones laid brown eggs and which laid white. The boy listened. His expression caught somewhere between awe and shyness. Nonton watched them for a moment longer. Then went back to his work. There'd be time enough to decide what to make of these strangers. Out here, decisions had to be made slow. The land itself had taught him that nothing rushed lasted long. By the second morning, the rhythm of cottonwood draw had already shifted, though no one said as much. Out here, change wasn't marked with speeches or handshakes. It was felt in small, quiet turns. Caroline rose before the sun burned the chill from the air. The desert mornings could bite at your skin if you weren't ready for them. She stepped out of the barn, skirts brushing the dew-wet grass around the cottonwoods. The horizon was just beginning to glow, the red gold edge of day peeking over the Hooker ridges. She found a broom the day before and swept the loft until the dust rose in pale clouds, then set to work stacking the feed sacks neatly along the back wall. Jaime had joined Annie by the chicken coop, following her lead in scattering grain. Caroline hadn't heard him laugh in months, but yesterday morning there'd been a short burst of it, quick and sharp like the cry of a quail. She caught it, held it in her mind like something fragile. Anton came out from the house, his steps slow but purposeful. He wore a faded blue shirt rolled at the sleeves, his braids hanging over his shoulders. In his hands, he carried a shallow wooden bowl filled with dark seeds. He stopped by the barn door, glanced inside at Caroline, then knelt by a patch of bare earth near the cottonwoods. With the edge of his hand, he smoothed the dirt, then pressed the seeds in one by one, covering them lightly. What are those? Caroline asked, stepping nearer. Tippery beans, he said without looking up. They grow where others die. My mother planted them before the summer rains. Good for winter stores. Oh, there was a quiet pride in his voice. The kind of weight that meant the beans weren't just food. They were memory. Inheritance. Caroline watched his hands, steady and sure. They were the hands of someone who knew the land the way most men knew a ledger. Later that day, Nanton hitched the older Gelling to a small wagon and drove into Charleston for supplies. He didn't invite Caroline to come, and she didn't ask. She stayed behind, hanging freshly washed blankets over the corral rail, the sun pulling the damp from the wool. By the time he returned, the late summer light was slanting low. In the bed of the wagon sat a new pair of small boots, rough but sturdy. He set them by the barn door without a word. When Jamie found them, his eyes widened. "They're for you," Annie said, her tone matter-of-fact. "He doesn't buy things that don't need buying." Jamie knelt to run his fingers over the leather. "They fit. Try them," Annie urged, grinning. Caroline stood in the barn's shadow, arms crossed, watching the boy slide his feet into the boots. They were a touch big, which meant they'd last him through the winter. She caught Nanton's eye across the yard. He didn't smile, but there was a brief, almost imperceptible lift to his chin, as if to say, "It's nothing." She knew it wasn't. In Charleston, news traveled fast, even to those who didn't want to hear it. That evening, as Nanton unhitched the gelding, he thought about the way old Ezra Cobb, the storekeeper, had glanced at him, then at the sack of flour, the beans, the nails, and said nothing about the woman and child he'd seen last week. Nothing aloud anyway. People remembered Nanton from his scouting days, though some liked to forget the help they had taken from Apache as that saw what theirs could not. Now seeing a pale-faced woman under his roof, well, the territory had a way of inventing its own stories. He shrugged it off. Words didn't break fence, and they didn't mend them either. On the third afternoon, Caroline stood at the iron stove, stirring a pot of moss white syrup. She'd found the pods scattered beneath the grove, their sweet dry scent mingling with the wood smoke. Annie leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "Never had it?" Caroline asked. Annie shook her head. "Pa doesn't cook sweet." "It'll go on cornbread," Caroline said, her voice lighter than usual. "Or you can just eat it with a spoon." Nanton passed through, setting his hat on a peg. He paused at the stove, sniffed the air. "Smells like the old harvest feasts," he murmured in Apache. Caroline didn't understand the words, but the tone was softer than she'd yet heard from him. That evening, Jamie and Annie sat cross-legged on the porch steps, a chicken pecking near their boots. They argued, good-natured, about whether the Hookahs were taller than the mountains in Missouri. Caroline sat on the porch rail, listening to their chatter. Nan leaned against a post, arms folded. The last streaks of sunset painting the sky. "Jube got a good place here," Caroline said quietly. Nanton's gaze stayed on the horizon. "It's held me." She tilted her head. "Held you? Not kept you?" He glanced at her then, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. "A place can keep a man like a pin keeps a horse. Or it can hold him like the earth holds rain. Difference matters." Caroline thought about that long after the lad was gone. Those days later, Nanton took Annie to check a section of fence on the far side of the property. Caroline offered to cook supper in their absence. She found beans in a sack, cut strips of salt pork, and set them to simmer slow. Jaime came in with an armful of moss white branches for the fire. "Annie says, your beans will taste better than Pa's," he announced. Caroline smirked. "That's because Annie's never eaten my beans." When Nanton and Annie returned, the air was cooling, the shadows stretching long. They washed at the pump, then came inside to the scent of the slow-cooked beans. Annie filled her bowl twice, saying little, which Caroline took as the highest compliment. After the meal, Nanton sat at the hearth mending a bridle strap. "You cook like my aunt," he said. "That good or bad?" "Is shrive. She fed all of us. Kept us strong through the lean moons." Caroline met his gas. "That sounds good to me." In the nights that followed, the air took on the first hint of autumn. Coyotes sang more often from the ridges, and the wind carried a cool edge from the higher country. Caroline found herself falling into the ranch's rhythm up with the light. Chores steady through the day. The satisfaction of hands made useful. Jaime's shyness began to crack. One afternoon, Caroline found him, and Annie crouched by the creek, heads bent together over some private find. Anya held a smooth, flat stone in her palm, tracing its edge with her thumb before passing it to Jamie. "It's for skipping," she explained. "The water's slower here, makes it easier." Jaime flung its seed arm, and it danced 3 times before sinking. "It won't bit," and Annie grinned, tossing him another. Caroline watched from the bank, her chest tightening in a way that wasn't entirely from the cool air. That night, after Jamie had gone to bed in the loft, Caroline stepped outside. The moon was a thin silver hook in the dark, the cottonwoods whispering in the breeze. Nan was by the corral, checking the latch. "Place runs quiet," she said. "Mostly. You always been alone here since your wife." He didn't turn toward her. "3 winters. Caroline hesitated. That's a long quiet." Nan looked over his shoulder, his gaze steady. "Quiet isn't empty. Not if you know how to listen." They stood in the moonlight, the space between them filled with the creak of branches, the rustle of dry grass. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it wasn't distance either. The September sun had eased off its worst, but the day still carried enough heat to tempt children into the water. That afternoon, Annie and Jamie begged for time at the creek before chores. Nanton allowed it on the condition they stayed close to the shallows, where the cottonwoods leaned low over the bank. Caroline came along, a basket in hand, planning to collect mosquite pods and willow bark while they played. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. The summer rains had left pools deeper than usual. Annie waded in first, boots off, rolling her trousers up to the knee. Jaime followed, giggling as minnows darted between his toes. "They got more water here than back in Missouri." Jaime called to his mother. Caroline smiled faintly. "Don't get cocky, boy. The desert can drink it up in a day." They stayed until the sun angled low, the shadows from the cottonwoods stretching long across the water. By the time they trudged back to the barn, Jamie's hair was dripping, and his shirt clung to him. Caroline rubbed him down with a towel, fussing that the evening breeze would turn him to ice. The next morning, Jamie was slow to rise. Caroline found him curled under the blanket in the loft, cheeks flushed, eyes half-lit. "Jaime," she touched his forehead and drew back. It radiated from his skin. "You're burning up," he mumbled something, then turned away from the light. Anya appeared at the ladder. "He's sick." Caroline's voice was tighter than she meant it to be. "Go fetch your father." Non arrived within minutes, his expression unreadable, but his movements quick. He knelt beside the boy, resting his palm lightly on Jamie's brow. Then he looked at Caroline, fevers climbing. "You can tell," she snapped, fear sharpening her tone. I've seen him sick before, but this she cut herself off, pressing her lips together. Nanten didn't take offense. He rose and left without another word, returning moments later with a worn leather satchel. From it he took a bundle of dried leaves, a jar of yellow powder, and a small clay pot. "My wife used this," he said, setting the powder by the stove. "Queened. And this yerba santa helps the breath." Caroline's eyes flicked over the contents. "You know what you're doing?" Eve watched it work. Sapped Annie when she was near gone from lung fever. That was enough for her. "Tell me what to do." They worked in tandem without further talk. Caroline boiled water, the steam filling the room. Nanton crushed the dried leaves, dropping them into the pot to steep. He measured the quinine carefully into a tin cup and mixed it with boiled water until it clotted palia. Jamie stirred weakly when Caroline sat him up, cradling his head against her shoulder. "Used to sip," she coaxed. "That's it." He swallowed, grimacing at the bitterness, but didn't fight her. Anya appeared again, clutching a bucket of cool water from the pump. Don dipped a cloth in it, wrung it out, and laid it across Jamie's forehead. Then another at the nape of his neck. Outside the wind rose, rattling the branches. Inside, the air was heavy with the sense of steam, herbs, and the metallic tang of fear. Hours passed in slow measures. Glass cooled and replaced. Medicine coaxed past dry lips. Whispered words meant more for comfort than sense. Anya cuddled in a chair nearby, fighting sleep. Caroline never left Jamie's side. Once she glanced up to find Nanton, sitting close, his broad shoulders blocking the lamplight, his eyes fixed on the boy as if willing him to breathe steady. Near midnight, Jamie's fever spiked. His breath came fast and shallow, his skin up to the touch. Caroline felt her composure fray. "I've done everything I know," she whispered. "Not done, so much as to the air. If he goes," her voice caught. "I got nothing left." Nan reached out, his calloused hand resting on her forearm. "He's strong," he said quietly. "Don't look like it, but he is. I've seen it." She let her head tip forward until it rested against his arm just for a breath. "Judy better be right." "Ian," he said simply. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Jamie shifted. His fingers twitched, then found Nanton's knee by accident. Nan covered the small hand with his own. The gesture so gentle it seemed to belong to another man entirely. "You scared me, boy," he murmured. Jaime's lips curved faintly. "Don't be scared, Mr. Nanton. You've had a hot dream." Caroline laughed and sobbed in the same breath, pulling Jamie close. Nanton's shoulders eased, the tightness leaving them like air from a bellows. By dawn, the fever had broken. The first pale light slipped through the window, painting the room in soft gold. Jaime slept deeply, his skin cool and damp. Caroline sat beside him, one hand stroking his hair, the other holding a mug of cool tea she'd forgotten to drink. Nan leaned back against the wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He hadn't left the room all night. Anya padded in, clutching the small horse carving from the table. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of the three of them. Her father, Caroline, and Jamie in that stillness. "This feels like a real family," she said softly, almost to herself. No one corrected her. When the day warmed, Nanton stepped outside, rolling his shoulders, as if to shake off the weight of the night. The sky was a flawless blue, the kind that made the desert seem endless. He walked to the corral, running his hand along the weathered rail. The cottonwoods rustled overhead, and a hawk circled high, its shadow gliding over the grass. Behind him, Caroline's voice carried from the porch. "I don't know how to thank you." He turned. She stood there, arms folded, her hair loose around her shoulders. The lines of worry had eased from her face, though her eyes were still rimmed red. "You already did," he said. Her brow furrowed. "When you stayed," he replied simply. "Didn't run when it got bad." Caroline looked away as if the weight of that truth was harder to hold than gratitude. That evening, Jamie was well enough to sit at the table, propped up on pillows. Annie dealt him in on a game of checkers, her grin wide when she jumped two of his pieces. Caroline moved about the kitchen, ladling out soup, her movements unhurried for the first time since they had arrived. Nanton sat by the hearth, watching. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in this land ever was, but there was a warmth in the room that hadn't been there a week ago. It wasn't just the fire. When the bowls were emptied and the lamp turned low, Caroline caught Nanton's gaze across the table. She didn't smile, but there was something in her look, something unspoken, steady, and a little less guarded than before. He nodded once. She returned it. Out here, that was as close to a promise as most folks ever got. The wind came in from the south that Thursday morning, warm and restless. Don noticed it as he tightened the cinch on his mare. Down in the cottonwoods, the leaves whispered in a language older than English or Apache, the kind that meant a change was coming. He didn't have long to wait to learn what kind. From the ridge road came the hard rhythm of hooves against packed dirt. Not a casual ride. This was a gallop and a rider pushing his horse like it owed him something. Nanton straightened, one hand resting on the mare's neck as the sound grew closer. Caroline stepped out from the barn, wiping her hands on her skirt. Annie was at the chicken coop, and Jamie sat on the fence rail, swinging his legs. All three turned toward the road. A cloud of dust lifted over the rise. Then a horse broke through a tall run layered with sweat, ridden by a man in a dust-stained duster. The rider hauled back hard at the gate, the horse skidding to a stop in a spray of dirt. The man swung down, boots hitting the ground with a thud. He was lean, sharp-featured, his dark hair falling into eyes that scanned the place like a man checking a poker table. The gun on his hip was worn, but not neglected. "Non tombal," he called, voice carrying the rough rasp of long miles and cheap whiskey. "That you?" Danton didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, slow, steady, until the space between them was just enough for voices to carry low. Depends who's asking. Caroline had gone still. Her hands, which had been wiping dust from her skirt, clenched into fists. Jaime's eyes went wide. The man's gaze flicked to her, and his mouth curled in a smile that held no warmth. Caroline. She didn't move. Colin looked between them. You know this man. Caroline's jaw was taut. 11. Colin Ransom chuckled, but it was a humorless sound. 11. I reckon the law say more than that. Name is still on the paper back in Missouri. Caroline's voice cut like a blade. That paper means nothing. You walked out before Jamie could even say your name. Colin's eyes slid to the bow. So that's him. His smile widened ugly now. My son. Jamie took a step back, nearly bumping into Annie, who stepped in front of him without thinking. You've got no claim, Caroline said. Not after 8 years. Not after what you did. Cole's voice hardened. Blad's claim enough. And I aim to take him back. None stepped between them then, his shadow falling over Cole. You don't have a home for him. Cole bristled. Who the hell are you to say? The man feeding him, Nan said, his tone flat as stone, keeping him warm, holding him through fever nights while you were losing coin in some saloon. That's my blood. Cole shot back. That don't make you his father. Silence fell, heavy as summer heat before a storm. Cole's hand twitched near his belt, but he didn't draw. You want to settle this now? None asked, his voice so low Caroline almost missed it. Cole is near it. This ain't over. I'll be back with the law. You come back near this place, Nandan said, and it'll be finished for good. For a moment it seemed Cole might press the point. Then he spit into the dust, mounted slow, and turned the roan back toward the ridge. The sound of hooves faded, but the tension didn't. Caroline spun toward the barn, her skirt snapping in the wind. Nandan followed, catching her halfway to the door. Wait, she whirled on him, eyes blazing. You think I'm some kind of project, eh? A stray you get to save so you can feel noble. That ain't what this is. Feels like it, she shot back. I didn't ask for you to fight my battles. I didn't ask for this either. None said sharply. He was fine with things as they were. Oh, I believe that. A man alone in his fortress of silence, not needing anybody. Nan's jaw tightened. That's not fair. She laughed once, beat there. Do you think giving me shelter makes you a savior? A step closer, hands open, but not reaching. No, I think it makes me human. That stopped her. A took a breath. The words coming slower now. Anya looks at you like she's got a mother again. Jaime sleeps without crying. That means something. Carolina's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. I don't know how to ask for things. Neither do I, he admitted. But I know what I need. A looked down, then back up. I need someone who talks to Annie like she matters. Someone who can turn dirt into food and silence into warmth. And damn it, Caroline. I think I need you. Outside the wind tugged at the barn door, rattling it on its hinges. Caroline's chest rose and fell, her breath sharp in the cool air. You don't get to need me without also so seeing me, she said. I see you, Nan replied. Been seeing you since that first night. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Caroline shook her head slightly. I'm not yours, Nan. Not unless I choose to be. I ain't asking for that. Just asking you to stay a while longer. She glanced towards the yard where Annie and Jamie were crouched, drawing shapes in the dust with sticks. They too looked up and waved, grinning at something only they understood. Caroline exhaled. Y stay, she said, then added. But not for you. Nontan's mouth curved, not quite a smile but close. For them. She nodded once. For them. That evening the wind settled, leaving the air still and cool. Caroline made supper of pinto beans and fried biscuits, and the four of them ate together without mention of the day's visitor. But the weight of it lingered like the scent of smoke in golf. When the bowls were washed and the lamp turned low, Nanten stepped outside. The stars were sharp against the black skier, the kind of night where you could almost hear them hum. He knew Cole Ransom would be back. Men like him didn't quit when they could make trouble. But he also knew something else. Now he wasn't standing alone anymore. 2 weeks passed without sign of Cole Ransom. Though his parting words stayed in the back of everyone's mind, Nanten said little about it, but Caroline noticed the way his eyes scanned the ridges when he rode the fence, and how his rifle now leaned near the front door instead of above the hearth. Life at Cottonwood Draw carried on because that's what life on the frontier demanded. Work first, worry later. The days found their rhythm, shaped by the land itself. Annie and Jamie became near inspirable. At first they'd stuck to the yard, Jamie following Annie's lead in feeding the chickens or filling the troughs. But soon they wandered farther, exploring the creek bends, collecting smooth stones and watching the darting shadows of trout in the shallows. One bright morning, Dunn returned from the corral to find the children dragging a warped plank and a piece of canvas toward a shallow hollow beyond the cottonwoods. "What's this?" he asked. "Our fort," Annie said as if it were obvious. "So when we're older, we can still live next to each other." Jaime grinned. "We'll be real old by then, like 50. Nanten raised a brow. "Do you need more than a plank and a scrap of canvas?" "We find more," Annie promised. And they did. Old fence rails, sticks from the creek bank, even a cracked water barrel Nanten had set aside. They worked in bursts between chores, their laughter carrying back to the house. Caroline took to the small garden out back. When she arrived, it had been nothing more than a patch of stubborn weeds and dry, cracked earth. She knelt in the dust, working the soil with a spade, mixing in compost from the pile behind the barn. "You'll fight that dirt all season," Nanten said one afternoon, leaning on the corral rail. Caroline wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "Then I'll fight it." By the third week, tiny green shoots curled up from the ground: squash, peppery beans, and chard. Caroline straightened her back, feeling a quiet satisfaction. When she caught Nanten watching from the yard, she nodded toward the sprouts. "Still got a few miracles left in this land." He tipped his head in reply, "if you know how to coax them." Evenings grew cooler as September slid toward October. So many nights after the children had gone to bed, Caroline stayed up sewing by lamplight, while Nanten mended tack at the table. Words were few, but the silence between them had softened, no longer edged like it had been when she first arrived. One such night, Nanten sat with a small block of moss whitewood in his hands. The grain caught the lamplight as his knife moved slow and sure. He didn't rush, shaping it with the same patience he used on the land. Caroline glanced over from her sewing. "What are you carving?" "A bracelet," he said simply, "for a promise." She didn't ask what promise, and he didn't offer. The wood scent filled the room as the shavings fell on into the table. When it was done, the bracelet was plain, shaped from a single loop of moss white, smooth, but not polished. Its surface bearing the marks of the blade. Through 2 small holes, Nanten threaded a braided cord made from yucca fiber, its pale twist standing out against the dark wood. The next evening, as the sun slid down behind the ridges, Nanten found Caroline on the porch. She was shelling beans into a pan, the sound of each one hitting the metal soft and steady. He stepped up, holding out the bracelet in his palm. "This is for you." She looked at it, then at him. "Mosquite. In native. It bends but doesn't break. Grows in the hardest ground. Dog de fit." Caroline ran her thumb along the grain, feeling the small imperfections. "Why give this to me?" Nan's voice was low. "Because I don't just want this place to keep going. I want it to live. I want mornings with voices. Laughter that isn't borrowed from memory. I want 2 children who can grow without fear. And I want someone who knows how to make that happen." She studied his face, the hard lines softened by the dusk light. "That's a lot to want. It's worth wanting." Caroline hesitated, then slipped the bracelet over her wrist. It rested against her skin with a weight that was more than wood and corn. "I'm not saying yes to anything bigger," she said. "I know," Dunn replied. "But you're wearing it." She didn't deny it. In the days that followed, the bracelet stayed on her wrist. She wore it while hanging laundry in the autumn wind, while kneeling in the garden, while pouring coffee into Nanton's cup at breakfast. She never mentioned it, and neither did he, but they both noticed. Cole Ransom didn't appear, though the children once claimed they saw dust on the ridge. Nonin went up there that evening and came back without a word. Whatever he'd found or not found, he kept to himself. The fort took shape slowly, a crooked little shelter in the hollow behind the cottonwoods. Anya declared it finished one afternoon, though the roof sagged and the walls leaned. Caroline stitched together 2 pieces of old flour sack for a curtain, and Danton hammered a nail into a stump to hang a lantern that would never be lit. Every evening before supper, the children sat inside, whispering secrets and planning adventures too grand to fit in any house. One twilight, Nanton stood at the fence, watching them. Caroline came up beside him, folding her arms on the rail. "They built that out of scraps," she said. "In Native. Sometimes that's the best way." Caroline smiled faintly. "You talking about the fort or us?" "Both," he said. That night the moon rose full over the draw, washing the land in pale silver. The air smelled of moss, white smoke and cooling earth. Caroline stepped out onto the porch to find Dunn already there, his gaze on the ridges. "Still watching for him?" she asked. "I watch for anyone who means harm." She moved closer, leaning on the rail. "You think he'll come?" None didn't answer right away. "Maybe, but it won't change what we're building here." Caroline looked toward the little fort, its crooked shape half hidden in the shadows. "No," she said, "it won't." October settled into Cottonwood Draw with a quiet that seemed to sink into the earth itself. The days warmed just enough for shirt sleeves by midday. But the mornings carried a frost that bit at the fingers. The cottonwood leaves, once green as spring water, had turned gold, their edges curling like old paper. One such morning, Caroline woke to the smell of woods and smoke and the faint sound of laughter drifting up from outside the barn. She pushed the quilt aside, the chill rushing in, and padded to the small window above the workbench. Down below, Nanton knelt in the dust, his long braids falling forward as he guided Jamie's hands around a length of rope. "No, not over under," he said. "Like tying a calf to a post, just gentler." Jaime's brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth. Anya stood off to the side, arms folded, wearing a look of exaggerated impatience. "You got it," she said when Jamie finished the nut. "Told you he's better at teaching nuts than school books." Caroline smiled despite herself, feeling something warm press at her throat. Then Jamie glanced toward the barn, spotted her in the window, and grinned. "Ma's almost up." The word stopped her. "Ma, not Miss Caroline, not ma'am." Used ma, natural, easy, like it had always been that way. She rested her hand on the sill, gripping it as if it might anchor her to the moment. She didn't call back, didn't need to. The children had already returned to their giggling. That night, the dinner table was full, not with fancy food, but with voices. Annie told the story of how a chicken had chased her halfway to the creek. Jaime swore it was because Annie had been wearing a red scarf. Caroline laughed so hard she snorted and nodded and nearly choked on his coffee. It wasn't perfect. Jaime still left his boots in the wrong place. Anya sometimes rolled her eyes like she was 17 instead of 11, but it was whole. That counted for more. After supper, Dunton stepped out onto the porch. The sky was painted in streaks of burnt orange and rose, the air crisp. Caroline followed, drying her hands on her apron. He turned to face her, something small in his palm. The porch boards creaked under his weight as he stepped closer. "This is yours," he said. It was the most quiet bracelet, only now. The cord had been replaced with a loop of soft leather, darkened with all. They would still bore the marks of his knife, but it had been smoothed and rubbed until it shone faintly in the lamplight from the window. Caroline looked from it to him. "You already gave me this." "He gave you the start," he said. "This is the rest," she swallowed. "And what does the rest mean?" Nanton's voice stayed steady, but there was something raw under it. "It means I want you to make this your place. I want Jamie and Annie to grow up knowing they belong here. I want mornings with your coffee and evenings with your voice in the yard. I want this house to stop being just where I keep warm and start being where we all live." Caroline stared at him. the wind lifting a strand of hair across her cheek. "And what about you, Nanton? What do you want for yourself?" Hijas held hers. "I want to stop pretending I don't need more than quiet. I want to be the man who comes in from the cold and finds you here." For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of the cottonwoods. Caroline looked down at the bracelet in her hand. The leather was soft, the wood warm from his palm. It wasn't gold. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That mattered more than anything she'd ever worn. She slipped it back onto her wrist. They didn't speak of it again that night. But the next afternoon, Caroline found herself standing beneath the cottonwoods in her plainest dress. Annie and Jamie darted between the trunks, laughing as they arranged a handful of wildflowers on the old work they dragged from the barn. Mrs. Ortega, the midwife from the valley, arrived with a pie in one hand and a small worn Bible in the other. She didn't ask for a fee. "Some things don't need paying for," she said, her eyes twinkling. The ceremony was short. No preacher, no guests beyond the children and Mrs. Ortega. Nanton wore his cleanest shirt. Caroline had tied her hair back with a strip of blue cloth. Annie placed the flowers on the table and Jamie stood beside her holding the bracelet like it was made of gold. Mrs. Ortega spoke words that sounded like both prayer and promise. The children grinned. None kissed Caroline's forehead as if it were sacred ground. That evening they sat on the porch, the four of them. Jamie curled in Caroline's lap. Annie leaning against Nanton's side. The sun dipped low, turning the land violet and deep blue. Somewhere beyond the hills, coyotes yipped. Farther still, a wolf's long howl threaded through the night. Beyond the gate, the world was still what it had always been, loud, cruel, uncertain. But here, on this patch of earth, stitched together by sweat, loss, and mercy, they had built something that felt as solid as the land itself. Nanton reached for Caroline's hand, his fingers rough and warm against hers. "Home looks better with you in it," he said quietly. She didn't reply. She just held on tighter. The little fort behind the cottonwoods became a fixture of their days. The children patched its roof with new scraps, hung the lantern, and filled it with treasures of smooth stone from the creek. A piece of turquoise Annie had found in the wash. The chicken feather Jamie swore was lucky. It wasn't weatherproof, and it wouldn't stand against a hard winter wind, but it was theirs. One afternoon, as Caroline and Nanton watched from the yard, Annie wrapped an arm around Jamie's shoulders without thinking. Jaime leaned into her, both of them laughing over some secret. Caroline felt the weight of the moment. Nanton must have felt it, though. His hand found hers where it rested on the fence rail. "They're building their own place," she said. He nodded out of scraps. She smiled just like we did. As October waned, the gold cottonwood leaves began to fall, spinning down into the creek. Nanton rode out less often, his work shifting to mending, storing, and readying for winter. Caroline filled jars with preserved beans and squash. Annie and Jamie ran wild in the crisp air, coming in with wind in cheeks and pockets full of pebbles. No one spoke of Cole Ransom anymore, though they all knew his shadow had not vanished completely. But in the rhythm they had built, in the laughter around the table and the warmth by the fire, he seemed like something from another life, one not worth returning to. On the last day of the month, as the sun dropped behind the ridges and the cold crept in, none stoked the fire high, Caroline poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, and handed him one. They sat at the table, the children asleep upstairs, the house wrapped in the quiet of a place that belonged to its people. "This is it, then," she said softly. "What is home?" Nanton looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Home." That was the last word spoken before the fire sank to embers. In the silence, it was enough. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this.